Ladies and gentlemen, could you please take your seats? We'll start the sale in just under 5 minutes' time. £19 million. 19 million. At 19 million pounds anymore, 19,500,000, round it up, at 20 million, at 20 million pounds, at 20.
New York, the gateway to America, that for hundreds of years welcomed the stranger and nurtured excellence. Here came great men and women, some for the briefest of visits, others to stay forever. This city is perhaps the world's greatest repository of wonderful works of art. Van Gogh, Gauguin, Matisse, Renoir, and the work too of an Irishman who was regarded by them as an artist among equals. Roderic O'Conor, a man similar to Van Gogh in his passion for colour, light, paint and texture. This is the extraordinary story of a truly remarkable man. Roderic O'Conor is thought by many to be one of the most important painters of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century. His work spans almost 60 years in France, and during the whole of that time he never stopped painting. Here was an energy born out of dedication to a crusade for the freedom of artistic expression. O'Conor was unrecognized in his lifetime, but now his paintings hang in galleries throughout the world, at the L'Ermitage in St. Petersburg, London's Tate Gallery, and in art museums in Switzerland, France, Ireland, Australia, New Zealand, and of course here in New York. He never visited America, but he did invest here in steel and the railways and in the stocks and shares of an America that was growing and was to become the most powerful nation on earth. Whatever wealth he had, he shared with friends who were in need. And he was able to do this with modest wealth, which the artist always used wisely and never flaunted. Now, at last, scholars and art historians have pieced together the jigsaw that started with the sale of the O'Conor studio in February 1956. Then almost 1,000 works were sold and scattered throughout the world. This is the story of the genius that is Roderic O'Conor, the Irishman who loved France, who lived there, who worked there, and who eventually died there. Through diligent research, Roderic O'Conor is now emerging as a great painter of international stature. The painter of these pictures was indeed different. O'Conor's disdain for convention earned him the friendship of Gauguin, Renoir and Modigliani. Like them, the Irishman was never a mere follower. He was a crusader who dedicated his life to freedom of expression in art, oblivious to the disapproval of his family, friends and critics. Greatness in life never comes easily. The path to greatness lies through uncertainty, rejection, self-doubt, elation at times, and often lack of recognition in the course of a lifetime. And so it was with Roderic O'Conor. To learn more, we must return to his birthplace, Ireland. This land, these stones and dolmens, relics of another age, are the building blocks of culture, of passion and of character. The people of this place work with nature close at hand, and throughout history, the power of the sea and soil have made deep marks on the life and livelihood of the artisan. From such a crucible of natural forces and of culture came Roderic O'Conor. He was born in the autumn of 1860 in Milton, County Roscommon, Ireland. But like many Irishmen of genius, Joyce, Yeats, Shaw, Bacon, Beckett, O'Conor would leave Ireland in his search for artistic freedom and excellence. The O'Conor family had its roots in ancient Ireland itself. One of his ancestors was the O'Conor Don, chieftain of the O'Conors of Connaught. The last High King of Ireland was Roderic O'Conor. He gave up the throne in 1184, went to a monastery at Gogh in Mayo, and died there 13 years later in 1198 at the age of 82. It was an O'Conor who went to America and founded the city of Tucson in Arizona. He was Brigadier General Hugo O'Conor, and to this day an annual festival is held in the city to honour his name. And an O'Conor, too, was one of the first Irishmen to run for the presidency of the United States. He was Charles O'Conor of New York. The artist himself had many American friends. It was clear that the Irishman was continuing the family tradition of affection for all things American. His American friends included Alexander Harrison, Penryn Stanlaws, Robert Root, Paul Bartlett, and the Canadian James Maurice. In Paris, he was a member of the American Art Association, where he was a staunch defender of little-known artists, Modigliani, Gauguin, and Cézanne. The art establishment at the time rejected these painters and labelled them outrageous. Roderic was heir to an estate in Ireland of 1,800 acres, and his future was planned from his earliest years. His was to be a career in the professions. To prepare him, Roderic was sent to Ampleforth College in the heart of England. At Ampleforth, he became a pupil par excellence, winning many prizes in the classics and in mathematics and science. At Ampleforth, too, the young Roderic awoke to the delights of the beauty of nature and landscape. His first introduction to art was at the hands of Ampleforth teacher James Boddy. In this monastic setting, O'Conor's love of learning and his attitude of loyalty to friends took root and found sustenance. But life was changing for him. His brother died, and already Roderic knew that the professions were not for him. There came soon a moment of rebellion, and the love of art awakened by Boddy took Roderic back to Dublin. He went to study at the Metropolitan College of Art, and he remained there until 1881. 2 years later, he surrendered to the lure of continental Europe and enrolled at the Académie Royale des Beaux-Arts in Antwerp, which was led by the boisterous professor of painting, Karl Verla. During O'Conor's year there, 1883 to 84, it was Verla who introduced the Irishman to the use of more vivid colour and to a more dynamic application of paint to canvas. Roderic O'Conor journeyed to Paris in 1886. That year, too, the French capital saw the arrival of another Northern European destined to move and reshape the world of art, a Dutchman by the name of Vincent van Gogh. It was the time of the Impressionists, and O'Conor was struck by the vigorous innovation in their study of light, colour and atmosphere. Paris at the time was the centre of the art world, where artistic communities were emerging and developing. Artists came here in their thousands. It was the place to be. Many would return to their homelands, but not O'Conor. Here at Grès-sur-Loing, to the southeast of Paris, O'Conor had his first experience of Impressionism. It was here also that he fell in love with the Swedish artist Eva Löfstadt. Engagement followed, but within a year the relationship ended. At Grès, O'Conor was said to have been the one genius of the crowd because of his advanced painting techniques. Those who watched were astounded by the Irishman's personal advocacy of Impressionism. He painted with such passion and conviction that soon converts were attracted to this new way. The rest of the colony, which included Lavery and Guthrie, were influenced by the plein air technique of Jules Bastien Lepage, being content to paint the rustic naturalism of the limpid atmosphere and damp mists of grey. Almost a century later, in the 1980s, Roderic O'Conor's Impressionist work was virtually unknown. But within the space of a few years, and with his international reputation developing, new works were being discovered. An astonishing find was the painting of a sunny woodland glade, signed and dated 1886, and showing a brilliant use of autumn colours. This painting has a superb provenance and is surely the earliest Impressionist work by any British or Irish artist. For comparison, we need to look to Sargent, but O'Conor remains different. He ignores the convention of draftsmanship and linear perspective. The canvas is attacked with artistic violence. His tools are brushes and palette knives. The paint is laid thick to create a rich texture of vibrant colour. This is Impressionism bordering on Expressionism, and a truly remarkable effort for the 26-year-old O'Conor. Two other masterpieces of avant-garde art came to light in 1990. The first is The Bridge at Grey, a picturesque and seductive study of dappled sunlight on the river. Technique here is different, gentle and refined. The second discovery was painted in 1890. O'Conor named it On the Edge of a Wood. It was painted 4 years after the Pointillists made their first public appearance and was a work of shimmering luminosity. Yet again, this experimental landscape is among the first by a non-French artist, an extraordinary work. In late 1891, Roderic O'Conor returned to Pont-Aven in Brittany. He'd first gone there in 1887. The Pont-Aven colony, led by Paul Gauguin, shared O'Conor's deep dissatisfaction with the mimetic nature of Impressionism. With Gauguin away in the South Seas, O'Conor quickly got to grips with his new artistic milieu and secured a position among its modernist vanguard. Roderic O'Conor's earliest known post-Impressionist works were the paintings exhibited at the Salon des Indépendants of Paris in March 1892. He had left Impressionism the previous year, and his Van Gogh-inspired striping technique was yet to come. The sea would be his new inspiration and powerful force for creative liberation. These Brittany pictures are daringly experimental and anticipate the innovation of the German Expressionists in 1905. His seascapes contemplate with relish the limitless expanse of sea and sky, the ebb and flow of the tides, and the conflict of the elements. O'Conor's thick, viscous paint, the heightened colours and the bold gestural brushwork in a combination of non-representational hues. Here too was a dense, dynamic surface texture and a unique concord between psyche and paint. O'Conor invents an alchemy of colouring which is without precedent and which would herald the art of the new century. He harmonises mauves with blue and green, black with purple and red, brown and blue, intense pinks with grey and yellow. Black is used as a living colour, no longer as an outline. Black with purple and red, three kinds of green. Here is the boldness and the passion of O'Conor. In the 1890s, his Expressionism was a direct response to his emotions. It would impose attitudes that would set his personal life and his art at the gravest risk. He was destined to remain an outcast, a solitary figure, until his dying day. In his isolation, he joined most of the other masters in the history of modern art. Ironically, it wasn't to be his great friend Gauguin who would influence O'Conor most. Van Gogh, who had died 2 years previously, reached deeply into the mind and heart of the Irish artist. Bernard and Renoir had arrived in Pont-Aven from Paris. With them, some of Van Gogh's canvases, paintings in many ways similar to these. O'Conor was impressed and influenced. He was aware, too, of the great tracts of common ground that he shared with the Dutchman. Both were Northern Europeans, both had exiled themselves from homeland in the search for freedom and excellence. Both had studied at Antwerp, and both reached Paris in the same year. There, in 1890, O'Conor and Van Gogh exhibited 10 paintings each, side by side, at the radical Salon des Indépendants. Within 2 years of Van Gogh's suicide in 1890, O'Conor had already begun to graft the frenetic warp and weft of the Dutchman's Saint-Rémy and Auvers pictures into his own vision. Like Van Gogh, he favoured cornfields, cypress trees, flowers, sunsets, and scenes of the night. The leading critic and art advisor, Brian Sewell, is amazed at the artistic courage displayed by O'Conor. In his use of paint, there was never a hint of uncertainty or apprehension.
No, he had no fear at all. He was astonishingly adventurous. And the handling was not always consistent. He used different methods of handling paint to achieve different ends in the same picture. And you would sometimes get his characteristic striation of paint across the sky. And then in the foreground, a small seascape, the paint breaks up into an astonishing sort of spray and spume, liquidity. And yet, what impresses me constantly in his work is that none of it is by accident. There is always hard work behind what he does. It isn't a sort of serendipitous achievement. It's there because he wants it to be there. He was a passionate man, and I suspect he was passionate in more senses than one. All those late nudes, for example, suggest a kind of subtext to the life which is not apparent in the early things. But when you look at that marvellous landscape in the Tate Gallery, where the paint looks as though it's been squeezed straight from the tube, but in fact it's a very strong hog's hair brush, very heavily laden, and what looks like continuous lines are built up in stroke after stroke after stroke with equally matched loading of the brush. That's an astonishing technique, an astonishing ability to control exactly what he's doing and get exactly the effect he requires.
In O'Connor's striped pictures of the 1892 to 94 period, the ribbons of brilliantly coloured pigment can be interpreted as a potent metaphor for the primal forces of growth and decay that determine the cycle of the seasons. Like Van Gogh, he was fascinated by the capacity of the moon and the waning sun to transfigure nature, thereby assuming powers that border on the supernatural. The Irishman contributed a wholly personal interpretation of Van Gogh. Not for O'Conor an emulation of the near-psychotic intensity of the Saint-Rémy pictures. Instead, he developed a system which had decorative, abstract, and expressive qualities. This woodland scene of dappled sunlight and shade in Pont-Aven's Bois d'Amour is a good example. We see the linear striping, the interweaving of red, blue, green, and yellow strands. Here is a strong sense of pattern, almost with the qualities of a tapestry. Could it be true that this masterpiece, hanging in the Museum of Modern Art in New York, paved the way for abstraction? Robert Rosenblum is the professor of fine art at the University of New York. It's the city where he grew up, and throughout all his artistic life, O'Conor was close at hand.
Yes, I was raised practically inside the Museum of Modern Art as someone who was born and who in Manhattan, lived all my life here. I was immediately drawn to the great museums of the city. And growing up, I particularly was interested in what was new and modern, so I went to West 53rd Street, to MoMA, as we call it here, and tried to be educated there with the real pictures. And what I remember to this day was walking through all of these treasures of famous names. There was Bonnard and Vuillard and Gauguin and Van Gogh and Cézanne and Redon, and then on to Matisse, Picasso, etc. And there was one funny little picture by an artist I had never heard of. And his name was Roderic O'Conor, but even that was sort of peculiar because it looked to me, as I recall it, misspelled. There was no K on the end of Roderick, so that was funny. And then O'Connor, to me, always suggested that there should be two N's, and this one only had one N. So the whole thing looked like a typographical error on the label, and the picture was beautiful, but I didn't know what planet it was coming from. I mean, here was suddenly an Irish name in the midst of what seemed to be a French crowd. So that always made a dent, and I remember I scratched my head and wondered who this man was. He didn't seem to belong in the usual deck of cards. And then subsequently, over the decades, I would stumble across another picture by him. Sometimes there'd be some kind of group show of artists associated with Gauguin in Pont-Aven in Brittany, and there would be all of these Frenchmen, and then suddenly an Irishman would turn up, Roderic O'Conor, and I would scratch my head and say, gee, isn't he the one who has that beautiful, funny little picture at the Museum of Modern Art, and who is he? So that he's had a kind of subliminal presence in my life as a professional art historian over the last decades. Even in Paris at the Musée d'Orsay, there's a picture by him, but once again, he's sort of lost in the crowd.
In his figure paintings, O'Conor would sometimes allow the bold rhythmic stripes to permeate the faces of his models, thus ensuring the preservation of an all-over, uninterrupted flow of lines. This was a radical solution which even Van Gogh hadn't attempted. O'Connor's deep regard for the style and techniques of Van Gogh placed the Irishman well ahead of his time. It was to be some 12 years before even Nolde in 1904 began to follow the path of Gauguin, Munch and Van Gogh, a pathway already well trodden by the post-impressionist O'Conor. For the biographer and art historian Jonathan Bennington, O'Connor's strength came from deep inside, from his very soul.
In my 10 years' research into the life and work of Roderic O'Conor, I was always struck by the power that the painter could bring to even the smallest canvases. He didn't need vast areas on which to display his passion for colour and texture. The field of corn at Pont-Aven is an example of this. The lower half of the tiny canvas, it's a mere 15 inches square, is dominated by a swathe of yellow ochre, a cornfield in summertime. O'Connor's solution may seem perfectly acceptable to modern eyes, well accustomed to the burning cornfields of Van Gogh, but 100 years ago this painting would have seemed outrageously modern and experimental.
When Gauguin returned from the South Seas, he befriended O'Conor and often referred to him humorously as one man of Samoa.
Yes, I think you can never underestimate the opinion of an artist, especially about his contemporaries. And it was perfectly clear that someone of the stature of Gauguin could immediately recognize him as, not exactly an equal, but certainly somebody who understood what he was doing, and vice versa. No one was Gauguin's equal. He was absolutely a tyrant with his genius. But it's telling that in an absolutely fascinating painting that I just learned about through the new monograph on O'Conor, that a French artist, Pierre Gillieu, did a kind of allegory of Gauguin and his disciples in the personification of Christ as at the Last Supper, and one of his disciples, along with all of the Frenchmen, famous artists like Maurice Denis, is none other than Roderic O'Conor. So even as a foreigner, he was completely accepted into the French fold. For Gauguin, it always had to be not only a question of personal camaraderie or maybe even conflict, as in the case with Van Gogh, but it also had to be a kind of artistic camaraderie. He had to understand what the other artist was doing, and even more so, given Gauguin's ego, the other way around. But clearly he was willing to embrace him in his very special fold, and that was no mean achievement. It's a good thing Mr. O'Conor didn't go to Tahiti. I don't think he would have survived with Gauguin's crowd.
O'Conor would lend Gauguin his studio, and they often painted together. The friendship between the two artists grew stronger as the months went by, and once as they walked in the walled town of Concarneau in the company of Jourdan, Seguin and Anna, the mistress of Gauguin, trouble was close at hand. Anna, the tiny Javanese girl carrying her monkey, Taoa, was immediately the center of attention and attracted insults from a group of children. Insults led to an attack on the party by sailors from a nearby harbour cafe. Seguin jumped fully clothed into the water in an effort to escape. O'Conor, the Irishman, the strongest and tallest of the group, stood his ground and fought well at the side of his friend. Change was in the air, and soon O'Conor was to abandon the passion of his Van Gogh style to favour a gentle and more painterly approach. His work now can be likened to Gauguin's Tahitian canvases, adopting a rich palette of reds, pinks, oranges, combining with a range of green which would create lush and exotic landscapes. But all the time, the Irishman retaining his own unique independence. It was an independence of mind and painterly style that continued to project O'Conor once again beyond the horizons of established techniques and attitudes.
The astonishing thing about all that, of course, is that when you look at the earlier work, and we say, oh yes, he's been looking at Van Gogh, or he's been looking at Gauguin, Serusier, whatever, and then you check the date, you'll find that this is not the case, that in fact it's the other way around. He arrived at painterly solutions long before other people. And the development is not consistent. I mean, having found a solution to painting landscape, for example, he didn't then stick to it. He found another solution and another and another. And the way that astonishingly emotional draw that there is in the color, the handling, the texture of the paint, is used to pull a reaction from the spectator. Well, and he knew all about the emotional resonance of color, the way he uses red, which is a color that really does draw people. But it was quite deliberate. It wasn't an accident. And he was doing it long before anybody else. I would compare with Gauguin, for example. They were men who knew each other extremely well, very close friendship. He was even invited to go to the East with Gauguin. And you look at the texture of a Gauguin painting and the texture of an O'Conor. And it is O'Conor who looks into the 20th century, not Gauguin. Gauguin finishes with Gauguin. But O'Conor, although he finishes with O'Conor, but that's another problem, is always looking forward. You can look at any O'Conor moving towards the end of the 19th century and say, my God, this is German expressionism, this is the Fauve, this is abstract expressionism in the way astonishing.
In June 1895, Gauguin returned to the South Seas. He had tried hard to get O'Conor to go with him, but the Irishman declined. Gauguin auctioned pictures to finance his return, but on the day, only Degas and O'Conor bought canvases. As always, O'Conor was acting out of generosity and a constant willingness to help a friend. Gauguin never returned to Europe. At home in 1897, his daughter died. Thousands of miles away, Gauguin tried to kill himself. O'Conor and Gauguin had been the closest of friends. The colony at Pont-Aven had been a tightly knit community, and often, when apart, the artists kept in touch by writing. The letters were of friendship, of professionalism, and sometimes expressions of need. O'Conor continued to paint. He worked right up to the end of the century and into the next. The passion of the Irishman was capturing the sea, and then into a more mysterious world in which colour and technique combined to give expression to the changing attitudes and emotions of the artist. Some of his work anticipated the Fauve movement some years later. Catherine Bascom-Sands is a student of international art and the linguist who translated the post-impressionist letters of the period 1895 to 1903.
Most artists found it very difficult to get any money, found it very difficult to sell any painting. O'Conor would have been the only one really with enough money to live and also enough money to help the others. A lot of Seguin's letters are letters in which he asks for money or clothes or colours or painting, material for painting.
And is that a help O'Conor would have given easily and readily?
He would have to his friends, to the few people he would call friends. He helped Gauguin, he helped Seguin many a time, but he didn't have a lot of friends. Roderic O'Conor kept very much to himself in many ways. He was a distant person.
Well, were the letters which you have read and studied from Seguin, were they letters of professionalism, one professional writing to another, or were they the letters of a friend writing to a friend?
They were both. They were both. They talk about personal matters and also a lot about their job, about their work, their creation. Seguin seek advice and gave advice to O'Conor as well. And he answers the questions that O'Conor asked him, especially about etching. Seguin was a specialist in etching, and when O'Conor started to do those, he was asking Seguin for advice.
So there was a kind of artistic symbiosis there. They grew together. Mm-hmm. He wasn't led, O'Conor wasn't led by anyone, but he was an artist among equals in a sense.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And he was looked up by quite a few as well as a great artist and a great creator. But they also gave him advice. That's their relationship. There was on an equal footing.
Well, you've said that the letters tell us a lot about the lifestyle of French artists at the time of the late 19th century. Mm. What was that lifestyle?
It was a very difficult lifestyle. For most of them, it was a fight with dealers and a fight with patron of art. And the interest for art seemed to have died out a little bit at the end of the century for whatever reason it was. And O'Conor himself had no time for dealers. He didn't need them, which is one very important thing. He had his own money, so he didn't need the dealers. But at the same time, he just didn't suffer them. He refused to exhibit his painting. He may sometimes have one in the Salon d'Automne or in places like that, but very, very few. I think maybe in France, amongst the other painters, he felt more at home than maybe in Ireland, where the artistic company maybe wasn't the same.
Paul Gauguin, one of the greatest artists of the 19th century, died alone in Tahiti in 1903. Death, it seemed, was in the air. It surrounded O'Conor and oppressed him. Seguin would be next, and in one of his letters he told O'Conor that he was dying. He was afflicted by poverty, tuberculosis and dysentery.
Mon cher ami, je vois double. Je vais mieux de la poitrine, d'après le docteur naturellement, mais comment me remettront-ils en état? Souffrance, la fièvre, chier, pisser, et j'ai pissé 8 fois et chié 4 fois. C'est terrible, voilà encore un trac. La dysenterie est chronique ici. Quelle faim que dans du sang et de la merde.
O'Conor, the faithful friend, rushed to Armand's bedside, but his life had ended on the 30th of December 1903. Now, with Seguin and Gauguin gone, life in Brittany would never be the same again. It was the end of an era. O'Conor returned to Paris. He took a studio in Montparnasse and became a vital link in the dialogue between French and British artists. His new friends included Clive Bell, Roger Fry, Somerset Maugham, Arnold Bennett and Matthew Smith. To Smith, O'Conor was always affectionately known as Mon Maître. O'Conor reigned in Paris as the accepted pontiff of the group. His views were avant-garde, but he was also a realist who knew that his modern pictures were out of step with conventional expectations and wouldn't therefore be accepted at public exhibitions. Vollard had wanted to mount an O'Conor exhibition, but the Irishman refused. Vollard had a poor reputation as a paymaster. By 1905, he was again exhibiting at the Indépendant and continued to show at the Salon d'Automne until 1935. He served on the Salon's selection jury in 1907. He was their vice president in 1909, but through it all, he had nothing but disgust for those juries who were opposing the work of the Fauve. Late in September 1913, O'Conor exhibited 4 pictures in the Salon d'Automne. He had gone in the footsteps of Matisse and Derain to Cassis in the south of France. At Cassis, he immersed himself in the delight of, once again, painting landscape and of enjoying the company of Ferguson, Peploe, Camoin, Mencken, Marquet, and the American painter Anne Estelle Rice. The Scottish artist William Crozier remembers well how Ferguson spoke of his knowledge of O'Conor.
I was 18. I decided to have an exhibition, and I thought I would ask to open it the man I thought was the most distinguished artist in Scotland at the time, who had just returned from France, J.D. Ferguson, who had, I didn't know then, but he then introduced me to O'Conor, really by way of criticism. sometimes he used O'Conor, because we spoke often in the years that followed, right? He would tell me how to do painting. You know, he thought I painted very badly. Sometimes I think he was using O'Conor almost as himself, and I think in fact they were terribly similar. They looked vaguely the same, I thought. And O'Conor was always held up as the example of almost everything, that one should be refined, well-educated. You should paint in the French grand tradition, which I've continued to do, I hope. And all these things were the making of the idea, to me, of what O'Conor became in my imagination. What is astonishing about him is he actually became a Frenchman. He, you know, we claim him for other things, but he imbibed the whole spirit of France, and especially, I think, the spirit of the last part of the century, of the last century. He was a very handsome man. He was a very sociable man. He could sing reasonably well, it was said, and I think he was of. There was a kind of demi-monde as well. I remember Ferguson saying about going to cafes and restaurants, you know, where O'Conor would, you know, make a great fuss of the waitresses and you know, the sort of hat girls and, you know, the people in a social class that wasn't his own, rather.
Is there some part of O'Conor that has reached through the years to you via Ferguson? He's influenced you. Do you still find his influence and his spirit close by you as you do your own work?
Oh, enormously so. It's very difficult, you know, the passage of time, some 40 years, and almost everyone I've known since, you know, from MacDermot, the poet, to the painters Roderic O'Conor, Robert McBride, all spoke well of O'Conor. You know, in that world, he was terribly well known, right? And since then, you know, I've seen as many O'Conors from, you know, what was Leningrad to New York or Boston, and they always have the same thing. They shine in the best company, and after a while, as a painter, you're not really thinking of O'Conor as a man. An Irishman who painted, or an Irishman who appeared like a Frenchman or something. You're talking about the top of the bunch.
O'Conor soon discovered that the intense light of the Midi produced shadows which were so luminous with colour that they couldn't be satisfactorily represented by traditional tonal modelling. The artist responded to brilliant colour shifts by infusing his shadows, as well as his lights, with iridescent blues, greens, purples, pinks and reds. Unlike the Fauve, O'Conor never made radical changes to the colours he observed. He was always content merely to exaggerate them. He had more in common with his French colleague Pierre Bonnard, and like him, O'Conor was not concerned with specifics of natural detail and colouring, but rather with the heightened sensations caused by Mediterranean conditions. In this Cassis period, O'Conor painted more than 20 oils and many more watercolours, mostly out of doors despite the intense heat, painting the oils directly onto the canvas. It wasn't easy, and O'Conor had often to carry equipment over the most difficult terrain. His friend Roger Fry liked the work and bought. The paintings were admired greatly by Apollinaire, who saw O'Conor as continuing in the footsteps of Gauguin. By 1914, the world was at war, and O'Conor finally departed from Cassis. Paris was to become an abandoned city. The Louvre shut its doors. The Salon exhibitions were suspended. Concert halls and theatres were closed. Almost all O'Connor's friends left the city, but he remained and continued to paint. Some of his work was of the model Renée Onta. She was in her early 20s. They fell deeply in love. Roderic O'Conor never stopped painting, and after 1916 he began to move away from the mainstream development of French art. Surrealism and analytical cubism were not for him. His instincts took him inexorably towards the school of Paris with Vlaminck, Derain and de Ségonzac. Ségonzac was delighted to lunch with Le Père O'Conor, and when in 1920 Derain was introduced to O'Conor, he declared that he had never met anyone whose manner reminded him so much of Gauguin. Like so many people of genius, O'Conor had much self-doubt. Nevertheless, the 20s were a prolific and exciting period in the life of the artist. He painted many memorable canvases, often with the aid of a palette knife, building up richly textured surfaces. It was a time for marriage, and in October 1933, at the age of 73, Roderic married his beloved Renée in Paris. They moved the following year to their new home in Neuilly-sur-Layon. Here they were settled and happy, and O'Connor's letters show that the two remained deeply and touchingly in love.
Je voudrais bien que tu aies un bras comme tu m'en parles dans une de tes dernières lettres, même si tu me tirais l'oreille.
Thus I could at least caress your wrist, there where the skin is fine and one sees little raised veins. But for lack of anything better, I am sending you hundreds and thousands of big kisses, hoping that some will reach you despite the whims of the post.
Renée was a warm, cheerful and generous woman upon whom Roderic relied more and more as he approached the end of his life. The end was soon to come, and 6 months into the Second World War, in the early hours of the morning of the 18th of March 1940, Roderic O'Conor passed away peacefully at Neuilly-sur-Layon. He died in the arms of his wife. In the strangest quirk of fate, the works of the Irishman who in his life hated and distrusted dealers in art were discovered in a Paris sale by the renowned dealer Henry Rowland from the London art establishment Rowland, Browse and Delbanco. Rowland recalls in his autobiography the moment of discovery heralding the relaunching of O'Conor on a Waiting World. The pictures were hung around the walls with only numbers attached to them. The majority were in laundry baskets. I was completely overwhelmed by their beauty. They were the most wonderful fauve pictures, painted well before the time of the fauves themselves. I walked around Paris before the sale as if on clouds. I knew I had discovered a new master. He was the only painter to understand Van Gogh, and only O'Conor could paint the light of the Midi in France. This indeed was a big moment in my life. In Paris that day, Henry Rowland purchased 60 of O'Connor's paintings. Lillian Browse, his partner in the gallery, remembers well the excitement when Henry Rowland returned from Paris.
Well, we were awaiting them anxiously because Rowland came back and told us that he bought between 40 and 50 pictures, which was quite a lot of pictures to buy. And so we were really very excited and longing for the cases to be opened, and we almost tore them open when they came. And one after another, a whole lot of splendid pictures appeared. Rowland was very nervous because when one of us went and bought something, the other one was always rather on tenterhooks to know how much the two partners are going to criticize, and we often did, of course. But in this case, we were delighted.
This is London. To the galleries of this city come lovers of art from all over the world. In a quiet corner of the Royal Arcade, just off Old Bond Street, is to be found the Taylor Gallery, a place of gentleness and commitment to art. In this setting, Jeremy Taylor speaks about O'Conor and why his gallery is a London home for the work of the Irishman.
It's because I like it, and I can always sell something I like. In fact, I never buy anything I don't like. But the pleasure of being a dealer and a collector is that you can take them home for 2 or 3 years and live with them, and then finally somebody hits you with a checkbook and you have to let them go. But O'Connor's work is so striking and appealing to me that I can give my impression to my collectors, and I can tell them, just buy it, just don't argue with me, just buy it. And there's not one of them who've come and offered them back to me. They all want more. A couple of years ago, I found one in America, which I brought back here and put on the wall, and the first lady who saw it just demanded it. And they're around, but dealers have 1 or 2. Museums are never going to sell them. The collectors, the serious collectors, must have examples of his work, and we know to whom we've sold. The really serious collectors have all got. I persuaded them to have them, And that's where they are. There's definitely sleepers out there that haven't been discovered, probably misattributed, and they will turn up. They turn up all the time, but not in numbers, because we know where most of them are, but there's definitely some that we haven't discovered yet.
Do you sense that we're standing at the beginning of, let's call it an O'Conor renaissance?
Yes, yes. I can see a great difficulty in being able to buy stock for the gallery to replace the paintings that we always have. And it is very difficult to know where to get them now, because your collectors won't sell them. You can often persuade them to take another picture and do a swap, but they'll never swap their O'Conors. And so it is difficult to find stock, and I do believe that O'Conor is having a recognition, a re-recognition of his enormous talent, and I just think the whole future is terribly exciting as far as his work is concerned.
The Tate Gallery, London, Cathedral of Artistic Excellence. Here is to be found O'Conor. His Yellow Landscape, 1892, providing a linkage through the years between Van Gogh's farms near Auvers and Paul Gauguin's Harvest, Le Pouldu. Roderic O'Conor's greatest moment in his own country happened many years after his death. The occasion, the launch of the Bennington biography in the National Gallery of Ireland. The event was hosted by Cooperation Ireland, the international organisation for understanding, reconciliation and development. Cooperation Ireland seeks to recognise and celebrate the rich diversity of cultures that make up modern Ireland. O'Conor, recognised by many as one of the first Europeans, a man capable of transcending borders and barriers, was being acknowledged by his own people as well as by the people of other lands.
Now it is clear how important O'Conor was for Ireland and for Ireland and Europe, because he was one of the first really who went to the continent and made a great impression in the artistic world.
Do you sense, Excellency, that O'Conor is the kind of artist that Germans could easily take to their hearts?
Oh yes, certainly, certainly. I think he would be, it would be great to have him in all in our museums, but he would certainly be very close to the German taste and the German understanding of artistic expression.
But those for whom O'Conor will always mean most are to be found still in the world of great art. Ireland's National Gallery is proud of O'Conor and the paintings they now own.
You know, there's a feeling that he was a kind of, using a common terminology today, kind of the cutting edge of art. He had the courage to go and to stick by his convictions and to paint and plough his own furrow and to express his own independent personality in a corpus of work which today now is winning appreciation with a very, very wide public.
How difficult is it for the National Gallery of Ireland to actually obtain and to purchase greater numbers of O'Conor paintings?
I suppose at the bottom line there is the problem of money, and this will become increasingly a problem because as artists are discovered and become popular, become more marketable, and they can fetch very high prices, and Roderic O'Conor, with his reputation kind of rising all the time, will become really a very much sought after painter and will command quite high prices. The gallery would like to have more paintings than it has at the moment, particularly really fine paintings. I mean, we have a brief here to present the best of Irish art, and O'Conor would certainly be among those artists whom we'd very much like to see represented in substance in the gallery, not just by one token work, but by a body of work which would give people a true feel for the achievement of Irish artists in the realm of the visual arts.
For the last word in this story of Roderic O'Conor, Irishman in France, artist among equals, we turn again to Brian Sewell.
I think that genius has been remembered ever since it was rediscovered in the mid-50s. I cannot remember a period in my life in which I have not been aware of O'Conor. An extraordinary spiritual uplift is to be gained from looking at that marvellous landscape. It's perfection. It's genius.
And it's O'Conor.
And it's O'Conor.
20,500,000. 21 million. At 21 million now. At 21 million pounds. At 21 million. At 21.5 million. At 21.5 million pounds. At 21.5 million. At 22 million. 22 million pounds. At 22 million pounds. At 22 million. 22.5 million. 22.5 million pounds. At 22.5 million. At 22.5 million pounds. Last time, at 22.5 million pounds. At 22,500,000 pounds for the last time.